Shalom. Welcome to Hayom. I'm Rabbi Arnold Rachlis. In 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. A year later, Arthur Wascow wrote the Freedom Seder, and it was published in Ramparts magazine. And it tried to fuse a number of different things. Jewish tradition, the tradition of liberation and freedom from the Haggadah, as well as the civil rights movement and the need to make America be more racially sensitive and racially balanced, and also anger over the frustrating war in Vietnam. All those things were brought together in the Haggadah. It caused a lot of anger and fear in the Jewish community. But over these last 15 years and more, a new Arthur Wascow and a new way of receiving Arthur Wascow has emerged in the Jewish community. Dr. Wascow has written a number of books: The Bush is Burning, about Judaism and politics; God Wrestling, about creating midrash, creating legends and stories out of traditional texts; These Holy Sparks, about the Jewish renewal movement; and he's the editor of Menorah, which is a publication focusing on new ways to daven, new ways to pray, new ways to think about Judaism, new ways to express that Judaism. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks, Arnold.
We've had a long few days together. You've traveled around the Chicago area speaking to a number of different groups. One of those things you're involved with now is that you're the director of the Shalom Center at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia. Can you tell us what kind of work you do there?
Sure, but in a sense that responds, I was thinking as you talked about those days in '68, that the Freedom Seder for me, I think about it now the way I imagine a Rebbe, a Hasidic Rebbe might think about his bar mitzvah. That's the gateway through which I entered what is an extraordinarily rich tradition. And I look back at the gateway and I said, well, this I wouldn't have done, this I wouldn't do now, that was a little naive, that was a little stupid. But it was the gateway, and it was the only gateway that was available to me. So in that sense, it feels that I have learned an enormous amount. I hope the Shalom Center will be able to represent that learning, and it's a different place from where the Freedom Seder and where I was with the Freedom Seder.
Are you disturbed the way that the Jewish community received you, though, back in the late 60s and early 70s?
Well, it was really a mixture. There was some anger, there was also some response, strong and good response. And looking back now, I see some of the anger as maybe not legitimate that it was anger, because it could have been more open to what I was trying to do, but I understand the reasons for some of the anger. On the other hand, there was a lot of the anger that wasn't out of a sense of teaching, but out of a sense of utter rejection. The Haggadah doesn't have anything to do with other people. Liberation is, at least in Pesach, for just the Jews. I mean, that part of it, I think, was a deficiency, you might say, in part of the community's response to it. But on the other hand, I have learned a lot, and I feel good about the learning I've done.
Well, what do you think the universalist issues are today that the Jewish community is responding to or not responding to?
Well, in a sense, the Shalom Center represents that double-sidedness. The Shalom Center is little more than 6-8 months old. It comes out of a sense that the Jewish community is open to, but has not yet fully decided to make the danger of a worldwide nuclear holocaust a danger that the organized Jewish community wants to address. Already there has been an enormous change from what there was 3 years ago, when there was very little caring about that issue in the organized community, though many individual Jews were involved in efforts to prevent a nuclear holocaust. But in the 3 years in which the Jewish community has moved on this issue, there nevertheless are huge chunks of the community which haven't begun to move, or have, let's say, just passed a resolution, but haven't put any energy, teaching, action, education behind it. So the Shalom Center's role is to bring to bear Jewish perspectives on how to prevent a nuclear holocaust. We have drawn on the traditions of Torah, the religious tradition. We have drawn on learnings, lessons from the Nazi Holocaust. We have drawn on concern for Soviet Jews and the way in which détente between the Soviet Union and the United States seems to have encouraged a freer atmosphere for Soviet Jews, both in the Soviet Union and leaving it, and collision and head-on Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States has damaged the interests of Soviet Jews. We've drawn on all those things and others to bring Jewish perspectives to bear on this issue. And already there has been change in the sense that already I know of places where nothing was going on around this issue a year ago or 2 years ago, where there was a lot, and there still needs to be more. So that's a perfect example where 3 years ago people were saying, well, why is this a Jewish issue? And are now saying, yes, we know it's a Jewish issue. What is it that should be going on?
Well, you've created a whole new ceremony in Judaism. I mean, not many people get to do that. They get to redesign ceremonies, to add to them, to embellish them. But you created this rainbow sign tradition that a few years ago was observed in 20 communities, and then last year in 200 communities, and this year maybe 1,000 or more.
It looks as if
tell us when Rainbow Sign falls and what its goal is and how it's celebrated.
Right. Well, what happened was that a group of us began 3 years ago to ask ourselves the question, what would Torah teach about how to deal with this totally new question, the survival of life on earth? And we realized it's not a totally new question. There is a story, one story in Torah, which addresses the danger that all life might be destroyed. That's the story of the flood and Noah's Ark and the rainbow. And we began to study that story to try to learn from it what we ought to be doing to prevent a flood of fire, an overwhelming destruction of the earth by nuclear holocaust. And one of the things we noticed was that the Torah specifies the date of the Rainbow Covenant, the promise by God, and a promise we are supposed to join in to protect all life and preserve all life. So here was this date. It's the 27th of Iyar, which this year in the Western calendar is the 29th of May. And it seemed to us that this date, which had never been treated as a date to do anything with in Jewish tradition, that this date had in a sense been stored away for us. After all, what does the tradition do with dates? It gives the date of the Exodus from Egypt for us to experience so that we remember what it means to be a slave and what it means to liberate ourselves. And it gives the date of the giving of the Torah so that we can experience the receiving of the Torah. Here is this date, and nobody's ever done anything with it. Well, it seemed to us clear that the reason we'd never used it was that we never needed to use it. There was never any danger that all life on earth might be destroyed until our generation. So around those dates, which means this year the last 2 weeks essentially of May, we began to urge and encourage people in the Jewish community, and in some cases, locally, people reached out to other religious traditions, because after all, the tradition of the rainbow is a universal tradition. The flood was a universal disaster, and the rainbow is a promise to all, not only in fact all of humankind, but all of life on earth, reach out to create forms by which we could remind ourselves that from now on, in fact, permanently in human history, whether it's long or whether it's a short human history, we are going to face this danger, the danger of a nuclear holocaust. So if that's true, we should remind ourselves year after year after year to address the issue. And as you say, it has spread. People have developed their own forms, their own liturgies, their own ceremonies. Some places people have used rainbows created by balloons or by flowers, the colors of flowers and so on. The reading of the passage from Noah, both the passage about the flood, which sounds as if it comes straight from Jonathan Schell's The Fate of the Earth, the insects, the birds, the animals, everything, says the text, was destroyed, and the passage of the rainbow, the promise of the protection of all life. And with those readings, people talking with each other about what our obligation is, what we need to do together, how we can learn from this process to protect all life.
What do you think Jews can do about preventing a nuclear holocaust individually and collectively? After all, Rainbow Sign presupposes observances in congregations and in Hillels and in Jewish community groups. But what's the action beyond that, beyond the commemoration, the celebration of hope? What's beyond that?
Well, I do want to say that the commemoration itself is a form of action. One of the dangers of dealing with this issue, and a danger I remember very clearly because sort of in an earlier Gilgul, an earlier incarnation of myself, back from 1959 to 63 or 4, I was working as a secular American political scientist on the danger and the need for disarmament and so on. And then I got exhausted, burnt out by the issue. I got attracted by other important questions and stopped working on it. Well, in the years from 1963 or 4 until 1980 or so, tens of thousands of warheads, each one capable of creating something you can only compare to Auschwitz, each one, tens of thousands of them got made and put in place during those years. And I want to say to myself from now on, and I want to try to help say to the world, let's not let this issue become unfashionable again. This is not a question of fad and fashion. This is a question that we will have to deal with.
Jonathan Schell, though, who you quoted earlier in his book, says that the major problem in organizing people to face the nuclear destruction is kind of a psychic numbing, that they can't deal with the numbers of weapons, the destructiveness of the weapons, that they would rather work on more concrete issues that can be solved. How can we break down the coming or the potentially coming nuclear holocaust into manageable issues that people can address?
Right. Well, I think some of the psychic numbing is already gone, much less numbness in America than there was 2, 3, 4 years ago. People have begun to take into their guts the danger and to begin to act on it. But it does take acting to work. So if we can face this issue and know that we have to face it over and over again, the way we face Tisha B'Av and the destruction of the temple over and over again, and we take new energy. I mean, that's a moment of despair. It's a moment of sorrow, even of guilt. And we take the moment of Tisha B'Av, and from it, we move to Rosh Hashanah. We move to freshness and newness and new life.
I guess the difference between Tisha B'Av, Tisha B'Av is a commemoration of a past destruction.
That's right, and this is a danger in the future.
That's right. This is
true.
It's like a blinking warning light.
Right, that's right.
That's
right. All right, so what does it mean then to be able to act and to take the rainbow sign into action so we don't get imprisoned in despair? Well, there are many levels of action. Some is simply spreading knowledge and information so that Jewish schools have begun to try to develop curricula that would address this for Jewish children. And rabbis and congregations have begun to say that in the liturgy, in sermons, we remind ourselves. All right, but that's still, in a sense, within the framework of the community. How do we reach out then into the world? Well, there are several ways. One is through political action, that is, we have governments. Governments respond to each other. It's clear that the Soviet government responds to what the American government does, and the American government responds to what the Soviet government does. It's clear, as I mentioned before, that for the sake of Soviet Jews, where it's clear that the numbers who were permitted to leave the Soviet Union were much greater during periods of détente and dropped down to 0, almost 50 last year, when there's renewed, intense Cold War, that for the sake of Soviet Jews, we should be acting on our government, on the government we can affect directly, the United States government, so that it can have an effect on the Soviet government. There is an interlock. One of the ways to do that, and a way in which many Jewish organizations have said on paper they're ready to do, is to support the bilateral nuclear freeze. The Council of Jewish Federations and Welfare Funds, which is a very important and powerful and mainstream, I mean, that is the mainstream Jewish organization, and the Synagogue Council of America, which incorporates 3 of the 4 major religious communities, the conservative, Orthodox, and Reform communities, and the National Jewish Community Relations Advisory Council, NACRAC. All 3 of those important umbrella groups have endorsed a bilateral nuclear freeze between the United States and the Soviet Union. They have all said that it would be crucial out of Jewish experience and Jewish tradition to stop where we are, and that we can verify how to stop where we are.
And we're really talking about Jews, as you said, from every sector of the religious, every place on the religious spectrum.
And on the secular spectrum, too. I mean, people who are not involved in any of the religious communities, but are active in Federation Jewish life or in NACRAC, JCRC Jewish life, whether they're religiously focused or not, or have all agreed in those directions. That's true.
You're using, or utilizing, I should say, Menorah, the journal that you edit and that you created, to spread some of these ideas, but you're also in Menorah focusing on lots of other issues. Can we talk a little bit about menorah? For
Sure.
instance, the use of body movement in davening and
Uh-huh.
praying, the use of new kinds of liturgy, of ceremonies for the intermarried, of naming ceremonies for women. Can you talk about some of that?
Well, in the last 15 years, in many spheres, there has been a renewal of Jewish life. There has been an incredible renaissance, which is totally unexpected. I've talked to people who can remember that in 1955, 1960, there was a general assumption that intense Jewish life was a thing of the past in America, and that there would be a very mild Jewishness, and that there was not going to be any intensity or life, and that young people were not going to be interested in such things. Well, we have turned that around in 15 years. In 15 years, there has come to be real energy directed not toward fitting back into Judaism as it was, but into renewal. Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem, make new our days as of old, doesn't mean give me back the good old days. It means make our days fresh, new, energetic, alive, vital, the way they once were. And that means making things new, renewing. And menorah has been both, I guess, a kind of a place to report and a place to create. I mean, for instance, one of the things I'm most pleased looking back about is that there was this archaic blessing of the sun that only comes in Jewish thought, Jewish practice, every 28 years. Nobody remembered that. We helped remind people, and as a result, there were hundreds of places all over America where Birchat HaChama, the blessing of the sun, in fact happened. And people took a sense of renewed spiritual energy, a renewed love of Jewish practice, a renewed sense that, interesting, Jewish practice cares about real things like solar energy, even from the sun, out of that concern. We've written a lot about new aspects of the holidays. A lot of what's appeared in Menorah also appeared in Seasons of Our Joy, the book I did about the whole cycle of the year, which tried to reconnect the sense of the seasons and the sense of the history, the sense of the nature seasons and the sense of the history, and the sense of what goes on in people's own lives. And we talked about Tisha B'Av as symbolizing people getting burnt out inside themselves, as well as the burning of the temple and the sun reaching its burning point in midsummer, that people also burn out inside, and that Tisha B'Av is a time to experience that and go beyond it. So that there are lots of ways that we've been doing that. And it's extraordinary how the Jewish arts, Jewish dance and body movement, Jewish literature, the midrashic process, that is the process of wrestling with Torah to discover new meaning in it, which is a very old Jewish process. I mean, that's the way the Talmud got created. How that has reawakened. I mean, who would have imagined, the National Chavarah Committee has arranged now for weekly Divrei Torah, weekly comments on the Torah portion of the week, to be published in several leading Jewish weekly newspapers in the United States. Some of the people who write these words of Torah are rabbis. Most of them are not. Who would have imagined 10 years ago, A, that Anglo-Jewish newspapers would have carried Divrei Torah week by week by week by week, A. B, that those words of Torah would have addressed real-life issues and not been sort of the antiquarian, well, this is what Rashi and Rambam say. C, that they would have been written not only by rabbis, but also by Jews, amateur Jews, who knew Torah deeply enough and cared about it enough and wrestled with it hard enough to want to write about this stuff. Who would have imagined such a thing 10 years ago? And there it is appearing. So that, which is, sort of maybe the most ancient of the Jewish folk arts, the midrash art, the God wrestling art, that's reawakened too. So there's an enormous sense of renaissance. The politics is part of that. It is not that it is a political renaissance, period. The politics is a part of the general renaissance.
Well, it's a kind of holistic, with a W, right. Maybe with an H too, but a kind of a holistic, completed identity as a Jew. It's not an incomplete, fragmented, fractured identity. It's not passing resolutions to make political statements. It's davening the political statements.
Right, and changing one's life, beginning to realize that all the arenas of life, work and what we call leisure and sexuality and the family, and politics all have to do with what a whole Jewish life is about.
I want to talk about your intermarriage ceremony because, on the one hand, it's just even the concept of an intermarriage ceremony under Jewish auspices is a radical idea, perhaps a heretical idea. But with an intermarriage rate so relatively high, 20%, 30% or more, some Jews have decided that they need some kind of ceremony to affirm those kinds of marriages. Can you tell us about it?
Well, what happened was this. Two Reconstructionist rabbis, Rabbi Rebecca Alpert and Rabbi Linda Holtzman, and I, began talking about where the community is now caught. Something like 30 to 40% of the marriages that involve one Jew involve one person who isn't a Jew or who didn't begin as a Jew, but often who doesn't convert to Judaism. So the Jewish community seems to have thought there were only two alternatives to deal with that. One was to use the traditional Jewish marriage ceremony, but that is clearly inauthentic. Kiddushin, the traditional Jewish marriage ceremony with the chuppah and the broken wine glass, all that, is clearly intended for the creation of a fully Jewish family. So that option, rabbis over and over have said, is a dishonest option. The only other option that seemed to exist was, well, send those folks to the state. And some rabbis said, well, we'll send them to the state and we'll be friendly about it. And others have said, we'll send them to the state and we'll be hostile about it. But that option seemed to be, send them to the state. It's a secular event. We thought that in a fully Jewish view of the world, even an intermarriage is a holy event, a spiritual event. It's not just a secular event. And we asked ourselves, is there anything out of which in Jewish thought we can draw to create something that's not a Jewish marriage ceremony, but it also is not just the state saying, well, according to politics, you're now married. And what we developed, it's an experiment, and I think all three of us view it as simply an experiment, was a ceremony that draws, in fact, also on the Noah tradition, because the Talmud talks about the mitzvot, the commandments of the children of Noah as applying to all human beings. And one of those commandments is to be married, to create families. We drew from that an experimental service which has none of the pieces of a traditional Jewish wedding. Doesn't look like it, doesn't have a chuppah, et cetera, et cetera. And we will see whether that affirming that the marriage of a Jew and a person who isn't a Jew is nevertheless seen by God as a marriage and a holy act, but not a Jewish marriage, not a marriage that creates a Jewish family. So that you might say it's kind of a Jewishly affirmed universalist marriage. That's why we called it the Children of Noah ceremony.
What kind of response have you gotten? Have people been using it? Have rabbis been using it? Have lay
Well, we only published it 3 or 4 months ago. I know of at least one marriage where a piece of it was used. I don't know of any place that is used, any couple that has used the whole of it. We have gotten some letters that were affirming and warm, usually, by the way, from people whose life experience has said something to them about the necessity. Like, I can think of a couple of letters that Menorah's published that were from very strong, intense Jews whose relatives, children or close other relatives, intermarried. And they said, this offers us some way of thinking about and acting on this kind of event. On the other hand, got some angry letters too. And as I say, it's an open-ended experiment. Though I should say that the profound reason for it seems to me that there has been an earthquake in Jewish life. We usually think about that earthquake in other contexts. The Holocaust, obviously. The creation of the State of Israel, obviously. Those are earthquake events. They transform the situation of the Jewish people in the world from what it was that whole 1,800 years from the Talmud till a generation ago. We don't usually think of the earthquake that emerges from our living in America as a free diaspora, as a Jewish community that's free to be Jewish and free to take full part in American society. It's clear the intermarriage rates rise out of that reality. It rises out of a way we have chosen to live. We aren't living in ghettos. And American Jews have chosen, not most of them, have chosen not to live in the State of Israel. We've chosen to live in an open society. That's also an earthquake. We don't usually think of it that way. Well, the other earthquakes, we realize that you have to transform the way Jews go about living as a result of those earthquakes. The Holocaust taught us some important lessons about the way the Jewish people has to view itself. So does the state of Israel. Well, so does this. Now, we felt that in such an upheaval, such an earthquake, the question of the nature of the boundaries of the Jewish people has to be re-examined. What we do about it, as I say, we are proposing an experiment, other people are proposing other experiments, and it will only be history and the life of the Jewish people, I think, that ends up teaching us which way will turn out to be the affirmative way.
You're now teaching students at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. You've taught at Swarthmore, you've taught informally, you've lectured all across the country, you've written books.
Yeah.
What special need in you is fulfilled by teaching rabbinical students?
Well, the special need that I have felt fulfilled this whole 15 years has just been an incredible sense of delight and new life through wrestling with Torah, through the whole midrashic process, through wrestling with Jews who are wrestling with Torah, through seeing the tradition reawaken and come with new meaning. I don't know how to say it, except it's the delight that some people get, and I sometimes get from music or from art. There is this just sense of wholeness inside me. And then why with rabbinical students? Well, because they love it too. And that just working with that group of people who loves it makes it alive. But there are lots of non-rabbinical students who love it and who I've taught with too. Certainly for me it's important to imagine that the new sparks that arise between me and the students, because it isn't that I lay on them my view as to these things. What happens is the emergence of some new energy and sparks in them. Those new sparks will go out and transform more places, more people, more Jews.
Well, we felt that energy in those sparks today, and I want to thank our guest, Dr. Arthur Wascow from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, for being with us. You really taught us a lot, and through your books in Menorah and through the Shalom Center's work, we wish you a great deal of influence on rabbinical students and on Jews all through the world.
Thank you.
Please write to us at Hayom, care of WJUF, 1 South Franklin Street, Chicago, and give us your ideas and feelings about this program. Shalom.
Shalom.